long, long while. The head of the family was a Holland man, and the younger brother, his name was Rand.
Woe ah me, shame and sorrow for the family. Woe ah me, shame and sorrow for the family.
The Holland man he kept in a tower, a wife as pretty as a big white flower. She saw the brother and she stole his heart, and that's how the badness and the trouble start.
Woe ah me, shame and sorrow for the family. Woe ah me, shame and sorrow for the family. Woe ah me, shame and sorrow for the family. Woe ah me, shame and sorrow for the family.
The wife and the brother, they want to go, but the Holland man, he tell them no. The wife fall down and the evil came, and it burned her mind in the fever flame.
Woe ah me, shame and sorrow for the family. Woe ah me, shame and sorrow for the family.
Her eyes are empty and she cannot talk, and the nurse has come to make her walk. The brothers are lonely and the nurse is young, and now you must know that my song is sung.
Woe ah me.
Good evening and welcome to Like a Lens, our socially distanced film club organized by Yiddishkeit with the partnership of the Los Angeles Review of Books. I'm Rob Adler-Pecker. I'm the executive director of Yiddishkeit, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's discussion of Val Lewton's 1943 classic, I Walked with a Zombie. So it is a new year, and we're starting off 2021 with lots of hope for better things to come. And I wanted just to take a minute to ask all of our viewers, if you enjoy our programs, that you might consider visiting yiddishkeit.org to lend your support for these kinds of programs for the year ahead. Now, so much of Like a Lens series has been organized as a way of both finding an escape from the pandemic and the political situation over the past year, while simultaneously engaging with the most troubling issues of our day through these incredible works of cinematic art. And I think tonight's choice is a particularly fascinating film that manages to do just that. So as we turn to our film, I'd love to welcome our partner in all things Laika, Boris Draluk. Boris is the executive editor of the Los Angeles Review of Books. He holds a PhD in Slavic languages and literature from UCLA, where he taught Russian literature for a number of years, as well as at St. Andrews, University of St. Andrews in Scotland. He is also an award-winning translator and poet, and his most recent translation is of Andrei Kurkov's Grey Bees that came out in November in the UK and will come out soon in the US. So welcome, Boris.
Thank you very much.
So Boris, I want to start with you right away because this film is your choice. You suggested this film in a conversation that we were having about Val Lewton, and I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about what got you thinking about Val Lewton and I Walked with a Zombie.
Well, there really isn't a moment when I'm not thinking about Val Lewton, I'm ashamed to admit. One of my favorite filmmakers. Thank you for indulging me in selecting this picture. I really do think it fits the series very well. Not only because of the many overlaps with some of the people behind the scenes from former films that we've seen, but also thematic overlaps. It does exactly as you say. It does tackle some very important themes in a rather interesting, sideways kind of way. Also, what it shares with the other films in our series is a certain literary ambition. The form, it's a genre picture. It's a horror picture. The title of the picture, I Walked with a Zombie, was given to Lewton. He had to run with it, do something with it. And what he chose to do with it, I think, is much more ambitious than what many other producers, directors, writers would do. And when talking about Lewton, it's important to remember that we're calling this a Lewton film, and it really is. Although there were many, many hands involved in the project, he had the final say over this series of remarkable horror pictures that he released during the Second World War, and they really are a reflection of his vision. He was a kind of auteur in this regard.
Yeah, it's incredible because I mean he has different directors for all the especially during the short period of time where he produces all of these incredible films, different directors, different editors, well from the same kind of cast of characters, but yet his mark on these films is incredible. Just the sense of his authorship in a certain sense.
Absolutely, and there are many ways to characterize it. There's a great book about his films called Icons of Grief. But I tend to think of the dominant mood as being grief and the uncanny. It really is a marvelous a realization of the fantastic on the screen. We're never quite sure whether the things that we're witnessing are truly supernatural or simply very strange and tragic. So it's that ambivalence lends infinite richness to these movies and makes them infinitely rewatchable, like an Edgar Allan Poe short story.
Yeah. Hey, before we turn to our other panelists, I'm just wondering maybe you could tell us a little about what draws you to Lewton in the first place, about his background and his experience as an emigre here in Hollywood and his artistic aspirations a little bit.
Absolutely. This isn't the first film by an emigre that we've screened. In fact, the person that comes to mind most readily in comparison to Lewton is Edgar Ulmer. We watched The Light Ahead in 2020. In 2021, we're starting with a film by a person who was born the same year as Ulmer, but came from a different part of the old world, from Yalta, which, according to Wikipedia, on his biography pages, is in Ukraine. And I very much hope it is in Ukraine, but of course it's on the Crimean Peninsula, which was annexed by Russia not so long ago. And he comes from a middle class family, a Jewish family in the Russian Empire, a family that made very, very good. The background is pharmacists, moneylenders, but the generation of his parents, and namely his aunt, Alla Nazimova, became a major star, first at the Moscow Art Theater, then after emigrating to the United States on Broadway, and in the late teens, early 20s in Hollywood. Now, talk about literary aspiration. I mean, by the time she came to Hollywood, she was in her late 30s, but she desperately wanted to play Salome, which is a role that was considered appropriate to a much younger actress. She sank a fortune into the production of Salome, which at the time was a major flop, but has come to be seen as a classic. In a way, that this kind of forecasts the Lewton career. These, the films that were dismissed as genre pictures in their day have come to be seen as classics. Lewton himself, he and his parents came to the U.S. in 1909. He was 5 years old, and he was very much an American child, an American race child. But that emigre sensibility and that striving were evident from the start. There are many funny stories about his misadventures as a journalist. He got canned for making up a story about kosher chickens dying in a heat wave. And then he began to make a career for himself as a writer, publishing, again, pulp fiction that was slightly better than Pulp Fiction. This is kind of the through line of his career. And it was those early novels, some of them published under a pseudonym to avoid penalties for pornography, and presented as translations of Russian texts, were good enough to get him a place writing scripts. And he eventually moved to Hollywood in the late 30s. He worked with David O. Selznick, and then ended up with this rather cushy gig at RKO Studios in the 40s, making horror pictures as the head of the horror department. And he had the run of the place. And this is what we get here with this picture.
Yeah, it's incredible. And it's incredible to hear you describe it too. Just the combination of, right now where I'm sitting is so close to where they shot the exteriors of Norma Desmond's house for Sunset Boulevard, which makes me think of the Salome connection there with Alla Nazimova, and also just going down Gower and seeing the studios where these were all shot. It's so incredible to think about this world right here and so present.
And again, another intersection with Ulmer. There are many, actually, intersections with Ulmer between this film and Ulmer, but they were both on Poverty Row at the same time. And Ulmer was at that very same time pioneering the noir picture with a film called Detour. So these two genres, noir and horror, became vehicles for very important commentary on what America was going through in the 1940s.
so fascinating, and also just the connection between Ulmer and our screenwriter, for one of our screenwriters on this film back in Germany, and connecting us all these films together. That's amazing. I want to bring on two of our other panelists to join us. The first I'd like to bring on is Faith Smith. Faith Smith is an associate professor at Brandeis University, where she teaches across various departments, including African and African American studies, Latin American studies, women's gender and sexuality studies, among others. She's published work on the intellectual and cultural histories of the Caribbean and of the African diaspora from the late 19th century to the present. And one of her current project right now is called Strolling in the Ruins, the Caribbean's non-sovereign modern in the early 20th century. And just as a personal note, Faith Smith was my professor 26 years ago at Brandeis. And when I first saw this on Boris's suggestion, saw this Val Lewton movie, I Walked with the Zombie, my first thought was a recollection of reading with Faith Wide Sargasso Sea together. So it's a pleasure just to reconnect with this film. So welcome, Faith.
It's really great to be here. Thank you.
And I'd also like to bring on Jim Hoberman. Jim Hoberman is a legendary film historian and critic. Most of you know him as film critic for The Village Voice for 30 years, as well as a writer for the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, and Art Forum, to name but a few. He is the author of the unparalleled study of Yiddish cinema, Bridge of Light, as well as Red Atlantis, and most recently, Make My Day, Movie Culture in the Age of Reagan. And you can find his most recent article on Jaden X's shooting and the storming of the US Capitol in Washington, D.C. in the most recent edition of Art Forum. So actually, let's turn, Jim, one of the things that you had mentioned to me when we were talking about this film was that this is your favorite Val Lewton film. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about why.
Yeah, well, I like him in general, but this is my favorite, and it's for, I think, some of the same reasons that Boris is so fond of it. I mean, one thing that I appreciate about Lewton is his economy. His movies are very, very compressed. They're really, there's nothing is wasted in them. Also, it's kind of, it seems gross in a way to refer to them as horror films, because they're so subtle, and they work on the power of suggestion. And I've always thought that he should really be required a required study for anybody who's in film school who wants to make movies. I mean, they're very subtle. This one is beautifully directed, and Jacques Turner, who directed it, is a significant filmmaker in his own right. In fact, you mentioned noir. He made Out of the Past, which some people would regard as the greatest of films noir. So the movie, it's very fluid. It's dreamlike. It's kind of disconnected in some ways, in a provocative way, and then it has certain images which are so striking that I think they really just hop out of the movie and they stay with you forever. I mean, I think that maybe we'll sample some of them later, but the walk through the cane field at dusk with the wind in the trees,
right?
Sugar cane is really quite something.
Now, did people, when they first saw this film back in 1943, what was the reception of this film like, both popularly, critically? Were these kinds of smaller, shorter films, did they warrant major reviews in newspapers? And what was the kind of response to them?
Well, this in fact did get reviewed, but I should say that the movies that we refer to as B movies were just sort of thrown on. They were made to be shown, the back end of a double bill. I mean, his movies were typically 65 minutes long, or less, and actually, that setup gave filmmakers a certain amount of freedom, because they were pre-sold items. They just would be thrown in there. So this one, I don't think that he certainly didn't attract much attention in the mainstream press, but he did have his fans. I mean, James Agee and Manny Farber, who were probably the two most perceptive American film critics of the 1940s, both wrote not only reviews of his movies, but defended him. I mean, who made a big deal about him. The review that this got in the New York Times is fascinating because it's the animus that's directed against this movie, and which seems all out of proportion, and makes you wonder what else was going on. But because it's despite the lurid title, it's anything but a sensationalist film.
And what was the New York Times's animus? What was their beef with this film?
Well, I'll have to. I mean, can I quote it? Because
yeah, of course.
Rather than paraphrase it, with its voodoo rites and perambulating zombie, a nice 25-cent word there. I Walked with a Zombie probably will please a lot of people, but to this spectator, at least, it proved to be a dull, disgusting exaggeration of an unhealthy, abnormal concept of life.
Wow.
I mean, come on, that is more than just saying that it's a stupid, horrible movie. Found boring. I mean, he found something really, really disturbing about it, and then he went on to say that, point out that it was released during the war, and that the Hayes office and the Office of War Information had an interest in censoring or limiting certain movies. They wanted things that were healthy and patriotic and so on. And he mentions that they're upset about strong language in some movies, but this they let by, which he found much more pernicious. So I don't know, something bad for morale, I guess.
Morale.
What he thought, yeah.
For wartime morale.
Yeah, I guess so. I imagine.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, it's interesting to think about the film as being counter-patriotic, or having these kind of a sense that it undermines some sort of morale about American morale. I mean, it's an interesting thing considering when we look at the overall film and the role of the history of enslaved people, of enslavement, in the film, and also the ideas of white supremacy, I think, that come out of this film, and it's conflicted in these, or it's at least very ambivalent. And it shows that, I think that shows up in other Lewton films as well. And I'm just interested also in thinking about, maybe Faith, I mean, if you could just talk to us a little bit about what it means to stage the plot of such a film in the Caribbean, both in terms of this time frame in the 1940s and 1943, to have a film that places itself explicitly, even kind of cartographically, points the direction of where it is by having our narrator tell us that she goes from Canada to Antigua, and from Antigua ends up in San Sebastian. What does it mean to when we see this kind of emplotment happen in the Caribbean, and also that this is this very early, much earlier than Wide Sargasso Sea, taking a classic like Jane Eyre and resetting or restaging it or rethinking it from the Caribbean perspective?
Yeah. So one should say that for Caribbean people and for a Caribbeanist, zombie in a Hollywood title is brings a lot of trepidation, right? There's a whole kind of trafficking in all kinds of ideas, about sensationalist ideas about what the region means, the region's relationship to modernity. It produces commodities that make other people modern, but it's not itself held to be modern, and so on. And so coming 10 years, and in the decade after the end of U.S. occupation of Haiti, and knowing that the occupation generated a lot of lurid stories from Marines and others about what Haiti supposedly meant and generated, and so on. This film feels like, so even if you just look at the title and you don't watch the film, which is why I've been enjoying this conversation, because there's a way in which you can just look at the title and decide this is part of all of that. And I'm not saying that it's not that. I'm just saying that that one comes to it with that kind of apprehension. So in just drawing that kind of line, then we could look back towards what is it, White Zombie, which is 10 years before, and then forward to something like, is it The Comedians with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor? So that's a Graham Greene. I think it's the early 1960s, and it's the it's set in, so that's squarely in the Duvalier regime. So this is kind of just before that. So the Jean Rhys allusion is interesting because Jean Rhys publishes White Sargasso Sea in 1966, but we know that she'd been working on it for decades. And in fact, I think Mary Lou Emery is a scholar who has been linking White Sargasso Sea to this period of the 30s and 40s. So she's already trying to kind of figure out her relationship to her own plantation history in Dominico. So that proximity to Antigua is interesting because for me, that makes sense, that places San Sebastian in the kind of Eastern Caribbean, whereas Haiti is in the kind of Northwest. So I think that's interesting. But the film, and I think this for me is one of the most striking things about the film, the way in which white characters at unexpectedly and frequently are saying these words like onga and loi and Carrefour and so on. And it's when you all told me about the Zora Neale Hurston link that I hadn't known that really clicked. But I think that's really interesting. There's a kind of inside, a kind of knowingness, which actually then increases the anxiety, because then what does it mean for whiteness to have that proximity to all these, weird things? Right. And how does the film try to manage that proximity? And I think that's always the challenge too of Caribbean whiteness in particular, because North American and European visitors were always horrified, 18th century, 19th century, by Caribbean whiteness and its proximity to Blackness. It's like, why do they sound like that? Why do they eat those things? What does that mean? Who are they? Who are these people? And so there's at the very beginning of the film, I think it's on the ship going to San Sebastian, the older brother, I'm sorry, is he Rand? He's not Rand. He's
Holland. Yes, Holland.
Holland. And he keeps saying we, he talks about, if I'm not mistaken, he talks about the history of enslavement in terms of our story. And I think that's really interesting because the film, it's interesting to think about white accumulation, and it's both a family story, shame and scandal in the family, and it's also this anxiety about the fact that it is a family story, because then who is in the family? And so, and along those lines, we could get into this idea of white femininity as a kind of vulnerability, because it's through she becomes the portal, whether it's a mother-in-law or the daughter-in-law or the nurse, they in some ways become the portal through which the family is drawn into the other side of the tracks, if you like. And so kind of what do we do with that? So just finally, with the Jane Eyre theme, I think we could think about this idea of the nurse or the governess going into the home and what it means for the existing, the first wife. So it's going to be Bertha Mason, or if you think of Rebecca as another thing with this theme. What does it mean for this new coming woman? How does the first wife become the person who has to be expelled as opposed to the husband? I always find that really interesting, because how do you decide that it is Bertha Mason and not Rochester who is at fault? And you can see Jane Eyre working that out. So by the time Jane Eyre and Rochester get together at the end, she's maimed him, if you want to put it that way.
Right.
And
Blinded, right.
she also has her own money. So it's trying to kind of make it so that she goes to him, but she also has her own autonomy, and she's also kind of undermined the extent to which he'll have power over her, and so on. So so there's that, and then there's the whole business of the second son. Remember, Rochester comes to the Caribbean because he's the second son who cannot inherit.
Mm-hmm.
So he comes to the Caribbean, he gets Bertha Mason's family money. And then, in retrospect, he talks about this mosquito-ridden hell and the sweet wind from Europe, which is the what's his name, which is Holland's spiel on the boat. It's
right.
Oh my God, this place!
It's monstrous.
That's Rochester's thing. After he gets his wife's money.
Right.
Like, dude, so he gets the money and then it's a hell. So again, it's what does it mean for the Caribbean to be the source of accumulation, but also the place that one has to distance oneself from if one is to have a kind of metropolitan modernity. And so in that way, I think we can see some of the ways in which the film can be linked to Jane Eyre.
It's so interesting. I mean, both because in this film, they're so intertwined: the accumulation, the accrual of wealth from the sugar plantation, and also the idea of monstrosity and putrescence. I think that's how
exactly
how Rand describes it at the beginning.
Right.
In thinking about, and also the just what it means to have reconfigured Jane Eyre in this way in a year that the part of the background of the film, I believe. And maybe Jim can tell more about the writing of this and with the Zora Neale Hurston piece of it. But I think that part of the story is that RKO was planning on producing and did produce a full costume Jane Eyre in 1943, start with Orson Welles.
Yeah, it wasn't RKO, but it was Orson Welles, and Orson Welles had been associated with RKO. And Jane Eyre, I think, is something that Welles had done on his radio.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and so it's a perfect part for him. I mean, he fancied himself as this kind of Byronic figure in Hollywood, but actually that came out after.
After this one, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this was a speedy little film.
From what I read was that that RKO actually, because it knew had a sense about the development of Jane Eyre, they quickly optioned this short fiction that had appeared in the previous year in 1942 by this Inez Wallace, who had written what is perhaps the first kind of Caribbean restaging or resetting of Jane Eyre. With the title, I Walked with the Zombie as well. They optioned it and then needed to make something of it, and then gave it to the Val Lewton unit, and it went through all these different phases of writing. And I think, Jim, you were telling us something about the relationship between the writers. There's Carl Siodmak and Ardell Ray, but there was also the involvement of Zora Neale Hurston. How did that
Well, what happened, evidently, Zora Neale Hurston was in Hollywood for a relatively brief period of time as a consultant. And I think that Kurt Siodmak, by the way, is kind of, in his interviews, is kind of dismissive of this movie. I think that he had another idea for where the plot was going to go. I think that in his version, they moved back to, I think the third act happened in Europe, and it was reworked by Lewton and Ardell Gray. Is that her name?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, when Ardell Gray was researching the film, she came across Zora Neale Hurston's book, My Horse.
Tell My Horse.
Tell My Horse. Tell My Horse, and which was not exactly an unknown book. It made sense that she would have researched it, and so it's impossible to know what the deal was with Hurston. I mean, whether they just, had lunch together, that it was Ardell Gray was doing her due diligence, or whether she actually hired her, which is what Hurston seemed to suggest. In any case, it didn't last very long, and it was part of a generally negative experience that Hurston had in Hollywood, and that's the only reason that this is known is because she was on a very prominent radio show shortly after, and a show that was notable also for interviewing a number of African American writers and notables, and she talked about it. I mean, she mentioned it, and that's the source.
I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, just to think about what Faith was saying, but even the use of these terms out of Haitian voodoo in the script, which have this direct connection to her ethnographic research and her reporting.
That's right. They came from there. There are a number of terms: Carrefour, Hogan, Home Fort. They all come right out of Hurston's book.
So are we to understand then that this Inez Wallace, in her text, you would not find those references, or?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know that the original scripts exist, but I think that it's safe for some. They didn't come from the story.
Right.
I Walked with a Zombie, and they're not used in the Magic Island either, which would have been
right.
The most I guess the standard text for sensationalizing Haiti. So.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think this also brings us to questions about just the way that Haitian culture and are represented in this film. Both you have mentioned this idea of how Haiti plays such a dominant role, especially, which is strange, and the deflection of it away from the actual geographical location of Haiti into this space that's in the eastern part of the Caribbean. And so I'm wondering, for both of you, maybe starting with Faith and then to Jim, how are we to understand this type of strange, deflected representation of Haiti from the time, I think, ideas that we think of associated with Haiti from the time of the original Haitian Revolution through the United States occupation of Haiti? How are these things, how do you see them reflected and represented in this film?
So many African American intellectuals for the period of the occupation monitored U.S. Marines or U.S. domination and reports of U.S. domination, and also monitored stories coming out about Haiti. And so it makes me wonder if part of the reason for what we're kind of thinking about as deflection, but of course another way of thinking about it is that it calls it San Sebastian, but it's then an open secret because it's using all these terms and the dance and so on. And in fact, I meant to check the years that Catherine Dunham was in Haiti, because when I see those dancers and when I see the dancers again in the comedians, the first thing that comes to me would be the Dunham choreography, because I'm assuming that those are US based dancers and so. So one way to think about the deflection would be to, and I don't know this, I'm guessing, would be to appease or to anticipate kind of public a kind of outcry about Hollywood and Haiti, and so you call it that, and so it's something else. I don't know. So that would be one way that I would think about that.
Well, there are two things that occur to me. I think that there is would have been an additional interest in Haiti among some people because of Haiti's revolutionary.
Oh, absolutely.
But among others, because of the strong indigenous culture, which has certain ties. I mean, New Orleans is kind of a Caribbean city, and so there would have been that. And you mentioned the Dunham dancers. I mean, Maya Deren was connected with Catherine Dunham, and then she was maybe the best known amateur ethnographer who went to Haiti after the war and worked on a movie that she was never able to finish, but was very involved in the dance and things. So there's that, but I also think that somehow the Eastern Caribbean, which would have been more British, is that am I correct in making that connection?
It's British, Dutch, and French from island to island.
I see. But I was thinking that that certainly the islands that had been British colonies were in a way closer to the United States, more familiar, and that I wonder if that didn't have something to do with it. I mean, certainly Sir Lancelot.
Oh, I see what you mean.
It's not going to be. He's
right.
Nothing Haitian about him.
Right.
So I don't know. I think it's. I just think that it's probably so complicated to think of what associations Haiti was turning up. The American imaginary, and I also think that the occupation is probably, it's kind of in American history a footnote now, as is the Haitian Revolution, and I wonder if it was in the process of being repressed at the time also. I mean, in the imaginary.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things I think in this film, the idea of the unsheathed animosity between the different classes of people on the island of San Sebastian, with the figurehead, of course, that it stands at the center of the estate, reflecting both that history, the history of the revolt of enslaved people in Haiti, and yet we have this group of people, these plantation owners, who remain on the island as the central source of misery for everybody, or understood as the origin points of misery and atrocity on the island. And I'm wondering, I'm sorry, Jim.
No, I think, I'm sort of, they're almost like a family out of Edgar Allan Poe or something, that they're, these degenerate aristocrats somehow, under some kind of family curse. And the thing that I think is radical about this movie, and I assume this is Luton, that the curse is enslavement, and you cannot. It's introduced right at the beginning, and it's right there at the end. It's the basis of the movie in many respects.
Right. And why are they still there? Every day the conch shell is blown, which means that there's ongoing accumulation. There's a curse and there's prosperity. So they haven't left. And so what does that mean? So clearly they've decided that the prosperity, even if they haven't thought it through consciously, clearly there's been some sense that the prosperity is worth the consequences of the curse.
Absolutely, and when we think about the first two shots of the film, the opening credits shot is followed immediately by the snow-driven storm in Ottawa, where we meet our stand-in for the Grace Poole nurse character from Jane Eyre in Betsy, and she's being interviewed. I can't remember. There's some. It seems like a ridiculous name of a sugar company that she's being interviewed at, but that we have the idea of global capital of the markets making their way from this the sugar from San Sebastian, which makes its way to Snow White, Canada, where she is. So that accumulation of wealth and the way that it operates throughout the colonial world, skipping the United States.
Well, this might be going too far, but after all, Canada is the colony that didn't rebel. They don't have that history, which both the United States would share with Haiti.
And I think it's a very interesting leap over the United States in the film, and perhaps that's part of this question that you brought up at the beginning about the question about morale during during wartime. What would it mean to redirect the viewers' attention to the atrocity and the history and legacy of violence and enslavement in the United States if it's made too explicit? And I'm wondering about what you both think about what's happening with the representation of race in this film, especially considering two of our central Black actors in the film, especially Teresa Harris, who plays Alma, and also Darby Jones, who plays Carrefour. Yeah.
So the first thing is that I loved your reading of that first scene, the scene with the snow, because for me there's always an echo of an early scene in Heart of Darkness. This idea of the young person kind of going out, but there's a moment in the office of whatever company is sending you out where you see the map,
right?
And there's a sense of a kind of cartographic sense of what's out there and who owns it, right? Because in the British context, it's the pink spots on the map that tell you that the sun will never set on the British Empire. And so that's the echo that scene has for me. But I love that sense of reminding us about Canada. And of course, just two things about Canada. One would be in the 1970s in the Caribbean, when countries like Jamaica, Ghana were trying to nationalize their bauxite. Canada would be a major player in that kind of multinational conversation. And then in the 19th century, it's Canadian Presbyterians who do a lot of proselytizing among Indian indentured laborers, places like Trinidad and so on. So just to it just occurred to me, where is Boris? But,
we'll bring Boris back.
Yeah, okay. So I'll be brief. Just to say that watching it again, I was struck by the way that moments of Black sociality, whether it's the religious ceremony or even that scene with the baby, are then interrupted by white characters. And so is the film, what does that mean? Is the film pointing that out? Or is that something that we learn about the kind of inevitability of the kind of lack of Black privacy? The sense that whatever, at not just work, not just the long work day, but your leisure time is always going to be marked by this white presence. And so for me, that's an interesting way of thinking about the kind of racial dynamics in the film. And so the Alma character, in some ways, we can think of Hattie. I always think of Hattie McDaniel drawing those laces, because in some ways she's more invested in kind of a proper white presentation of white femininity in public, so that the family is not diminished. She's more invested in that than Scarlett is. So what does it mean for Black domestic labor that its role is to prop up white femininity, and how does the film kind of bear that out?
Let's actually take a look at one of these interesting moments in the film where I think that there's this kind of interstitial moment almost between this space, the white domestic space, which is then mediated through the figure of Alma, who gives directions to the home floor. And then we have Betsy taking Jessica to the home floor, and we have this encounter in this sugarcane fields. If we can roll that, and then maybe. So I'm interested in both of your thoughts on this one particular scene. I think it's one of the most striking scenes in the film, which has this figure of Darby Jones, who is known in other films for being this highly acrobatic actor, and here is exceptionally still in this shot, and what it might tell us about both about what's happening in this film in the representation of Black characters, but also maybe what's a little bit, maybe Jim can share a little bit about what's happening with the representation of Black actors during this time period.
Well, this is when you first get, you know, an attempt to, however tentative, to have Black actors playing more, let's say, rounded roles. I mean, more serious roles. I mean, appearing as people in their own right. And so Darby Jones is one of several Black actors who were in this movie who were all quite different. I mean, Alma Teresa Harris, you know, she plays a kind of standard role as the family maid, but with a much greater degree of intelligence. I mean, she's got more lines. I mean, she's an active character. And then you have Sir Lancelot, you know, who pops up and is both a kind of placating and sinister at the same time, very complicated, his relationship with the family. I mean, the feeling that I get is that they're all very bound up with each other. Mm-hmm. And it's it's an unequal situation, certainly, but Alma is part of this family, and so and this family is in its way beholden to the Calypso singer who made up a song about them. He knows them very well. You know, and Darby Jones is he's uncanny. He's an uncanny figure, and you know, you would think that in the movie, I mean, he's placed there as the monster. I mean, you know, suddenly there he is. He's so tall, and you know, his stillness has something frightening about it. But there's a tragic quality to him, which is it's hard to describe. I mean, he really is almost something premortal. I mean, it's you know, there's something, you know, or he's like a kind of a god come down to earth. I mean, it's as the guardian of the crossroads. I mean, he has this, again, you know, this name that they got from you know, Carrefour, the crossroads, which kind of comes out of Zora Neale Hurston's book. So I think that these are unusual. Also, I'm sorry that I didn't do more research on the Howden, who has a his name is I think it's Spanish, but it seems, you know, possibly a Mexican name, and I know that he was a dancer, and he's also awfully good in this, you know, in this small role that he, you know, when he summons the wife to come to the home for, you know, with this dance and with the little doll and so on. I mean, that's really a fantastic moment. So I think that all of these characters are quite different. And whereas I would suggest that the nurse is a completely bland. I mean, she's just a function of the plot, and so are they all, in a way. The white characters. I mean, there's you're not really. I don't think that one has much curiosity about any of them, except for the wife, who's been transformed into she's the zombie in the movie.
Yeah.
For me, the Carrefour character is very disturbing. And of course, that for me is connected to the fact that he is in this film. So in this kind of container, I can only see him as someone who is meant to scare, meant to alarm. So that there's something that is I can't see him outside of that context, but I can imagine and project. You know, I can wish other things for him. But in the context of this film, especially that moment that we just played when they suddenly come upon him, that for me is part of those kind of old tropes of just his black being is enough to be alarming and so on. It's hard for me to see him outside of that context, even as I want to see him as something else. And then the other thing is that I think the last time we see him, he has, what's her name? I'm sorry, in his arms, right?
Jessica, yeah.
And so in some ways then, what does it mean again that the purpose, the role of blackness is to bear up whiteness, right? Is to support it and to make sure that even at the end, it is, you know, it has as much humanity. So I feel that comes at the expense of his humanity, and so it's hard for me to see it outside of that context.
There's an interesting play that happens though in like almost a trick, I think, and I wish I had we had a clip of this. The opening sequence of the film that's underneath the opening titles, where Betsy, our central character, the nurse, says the title of the film and then laughs. I walked with a zombie, haha, that's so strange. But the actual thing that's unfolding behind her is, it's hard to keep this in mind while we watch the whole film, but is her strolling on the beachside, which I believe is shot here in Malibu at Leo Creo Beach.
Oh, really?
With Darby Jones on this kind of stroll that doesn't take place in the course of the film, of course,
right.
And it must take place after this event, or it's a fantasy of some sort. But that's when she says she's walked with a zombie.
She means him then.
The image that we see is him, even though the narrative tells us that it's Jessica. And
so for me, his eyes, if the zombie is the figure that is, its body is with us, but its soul has been extracted as a function of the extractive work of capitalism, then for me, that's what I see in Darby. And so for me, the title of the film is linked to him. I have to remind myself that it's really young Mrs. Rand,
right?
And so, not Mrs. Rand, Mrs. Holland, right? Yeah. So that's interesting. I have to go back and look at the opening scene.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a play. I mean, there are two zombies,
right?
There's White Zombie is in the early movie, but the thing with Darby Jones, I mean, even though he has, I see him as a tragic figure, and maybe this is reading too much, because I certainly understand, the discomfort, and also that it's so close to being a disturbing cliche. But his physical presence. I mean, it's not just that he's a that it's a black male body, but he is like a West African sculpture or something.
Mm-hmm.
He's so distinctive in his physique, and so that there's the sense of him being humbled or distorted by this situation, which I think ties him into the ship's prow that they keep,
right?
Other tragic thing, and so anyway, that's my
yeah. And I think I wanted just to ask Boris, because one of the things that I was
Boris.
Hello, Faith.
You're back.
It was the first time anyone's ever asked where's Boris.
Okay.
Thank you.
I was wondering, because one of the things that I was thinking about what you had said earlier about the poetic aspirations or the literariness of Lewton, and thinking about that scene among others, if you wanted to comment a little bit about the poetry that we see that comes from this. Before we turn to I see that we have some questions also on social media that we should address too, but I wanted to turn to you about that question, about the poetry of it.
Sure, I'll be very quick. I'll just say that what Jim said earlier about this being like a Poe story in which a decrepit house or a decrepit place swallows or holds these people fast is absolutely true. And in a way, it's very easy to apply a Freudian reading. This whole film is about the longing for death. Everyone in this film that's attached to this family is longing for death in their own way. That on aboard ship at the start of the picture, there's a very, again, poetic observation that this is why these people but including us celebrate at a funeral and mourn when a baby is born. Mm-hmm. And in a way, the film kind of delivers evidence for this observation as it develops. And at the very end, voodoo itself lends itself so beautifully to metaphor, because of course it is a kind of metaphor. Something happens to a doll and then it happens elsewhere to a living human being. And we cannot trace literally the connection, metonymically, the connection between these two objects. And we're left wondering whether this is really what happened. What is the link between the statue and misery? What is the link between the arrow and the little saber in the sabrer's hand? That's all left to us to speculate about. And that's really the poetry of the film, and its fantastic nature.
Yeah. We have a question from one of our viewers, Ken, who asked a question about how do you read the mother character? She seems affable, she seems fearsome, she tries to confess, but she doesn't. She appears in the back room at the religious ceremony with some sort of power. Is she the bad seed? I should also note that the Mrs. Rand character reappears in another film later, also in San Sebastian, playing a completely different part, but with in the same location and the same actor.
What film?
In the film, The Ghost Ship, where she lives on the island of San Sebastian and is the kind of romantic partner of the lunatic captain of the ghost ship. But yes, how do you all think of this particular character, the mother character, Mrs. Rand, in the film?
I think the viewer got it. I mean, mentioning all these massive contradictions and this, the way that the movie, pivots around once she's exposed as the as the mastermind, and the one who caused Jessica's downfall, and I think that it's part of the beauty of the movie that it's so slippery in deciding whether there's actually supernaturalism, whether this is all some kind of twisted family drama that's being played out there, and so I don't have I wouldn't have. Hello.
Speaking of twisted family drama, Jim.
Yeah.
Okay, you're on TV. I don't know
So,
the really. I don't have a theory.
So both she and Sir Lancelot allude to the fact that something has to happen because the younger brother has gotten entangled with this couple.
Mm-hmm.
I believe she says that, and the song says that.
Right.
So in some ways, it seemed to me that that's one way of pointing to a moment where there are many ways in which you could say, depending on how you decide what the family is. Is the family the plantation family with the slaveholder as patriarch and so on? But in this particular family unit, the attraction between the Holland wife and the younger brother is a problem that the mother tries to address.
Yes.
And it seems to me that her remorse at the very end. So when Darby, the Darby character, is bringing her back in his arms, she says she's remorseful because I think she's saying this is all because of me, and I take her the previous explanation to be saying that I did it because something had to be done. There was an attraction in the family that was going to bring the whole Poppy show down, and I had to do something.
And we know she's had 2 husbands, but we don't really know what.
So maybe she knew what she was exactly.
And the ambiguities keep piling up because at that moment when she's being carried out into the sea, Cara 4 comes up. Is it to save them or to
That's right.
to destroy them?
Right.
Yeah. To deliver them, really.
Yes.
Is
precisely.
We have another question here. Olga asks about the soundtrack, and there are a number of interesting pieces of music that both one of them accompanies the ship ride from Antigua to San Sebastian in the background. There's also 2 songs that Sir Lancelot sings very clearly. One is British Grenadiers, and the other song that he sings is the song he wrote for this, which in this is called Fort Holland Calypso, which then becomes Shame and Sorrow, and then Shame and Scandal in the Family. And then we have other songs. We have an actual research song. We can imagine that may have been brought through the intervention of Zora Neale Hurston for the ceremonial scenes that accompany all of the kind of musical elements that run throughout. I'm wondering if what we can think about in terms of the use of soundtrack here. One of the things I'm particularly struck by, of course, in the soundtrack is the emergence of Calypso in 1943 here from this film into popular culture. But I'm wondering, maybe Faith, if you want to speak a little bit about what that movement from this film, or what the soundtrack within the film, which is all heard by our participants. It's not extra. It's actually all heard sound in the film. What that means.
But thanks, Olga, because I was thinking about the drums, and drums bring anxiety for Black people, for everybody in the kind of Caribbean soundscape, right? It's the, I was raised Presbyterian, and so the drumming outside means Rastafari. It means a whole world that I was being raised to, maybe respect, but certainly not to join, right? So drums is like, oh, those drums. In some Hollywood genre, that if a white appearing character is tapping her feet with the drums, then that tells us something, right? Those drums, how come you know that song, right? So there's a moment when I was thinking about the drums and I don't know if it's Chopin or Liszt, the da 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 da. The Holland is playing it on the piano, isn't he?
Right.
And so I'm thinking of that juxtaposition as well, because I believe we're hearing the drums when he's playing it, I think. And so I was thinking about that. But on to the Calypso. So in 1943, an American MC visited a Calypso tent in Trinidad and heard Rum and Coca-Cola, and went to the US, changed some of the words and presented it to the Andrews Sisters as his composition, which they then recorded, I think, in late 1944, and it was a big hit.
Yeah.
All of which to say that the US had a base in Trinidad, and as Harvey Neptune points out in his work, US soldiers were very, very important to the rejuvenation of the Calypso tent. In fact, many elite Trinidadians who wouldn't normally have, visited a Calypso tent did so because U.S. soldiers were patrons of the tent, and so I'm saying that thing about the Andrews Sisters and Rum and Coca-Cola in Trinidad because we could see Sir Lancelot as part of that, not always just or even dynamic, but as part of that musical translation or communication between North America and the Caribbean. And so that, of course, later on, we're going to get Belafonte, right, who is going to be singing it. And so a film like Island in the Sun will be interesting. And just to see one more thing, that scene where the fishermen are spear fishing and find the body, that's part of my discomfort with the Darby character, because that scene with the black men choreographed that way in the water mirrors a scene in Island in the Sun where he's singing the Banana Boat song, I think it is. And so I'm just kind of thinking about what happens to the black masculine body in the context of Hollywood cinematography. So that's
absolutely. I mean, it's fascinating just to think about the evolution of a song like Rum and Coca-Cola specifically, which makes its reference to military occupation and sex work, and all, and it's sung in this very strange, almost auditory Caribbean, almost auditory blackface, I would say, by one of the Andrews sisters, who sings with a thick Trinidadian accent, or attempt at a Trinidadian accent in the film, in the song. In Rum and Coca-Cola, when the Andrews sisters, I don't know which sister sings like that, but only one of them does. But it's interesting to think about the evolution of these texts into the present day, which brings me, I think we're running a little close to the end of our time, and I wanted to ask you all if you could think about, how does this film thematically, historically, how does it bring us to the present day? What do you think this film conjures or gets you thinking about with regard to our present historical moment? And maybe we could start with Jim and then go around.
Well, certainly, zombies are the monsters du jour. That's been true for a while. However, this movie I don't think is the source of that, and I think that it's as I said before, I think that it's startling to see a Hollywood movie. This came out 3 years after Gone with the Wind, a movie which is just like a full-throated defense of slavery. I mean, that's I don't know if there's any other way really to see it. I mean, we unabashed to find a movie that's very modest and that is critical from beginning to end, no matter what cliches it may use. I mean, there's no apology. There's no glamorizing of the situation of the black characters in this film. So that I see is something I wanted to say parenthetically. That Lancelot went on and he sang "The Century of the Common Man," the Wallace campaign in the 1948 presidential campaign. That was one of Henry Wallace's campaign songs. So he was an internationalist.
Right.
Anyway,
And Faith, what are your thoughts on that, on the present moment with this film?
So my students are making me watch Lovecraft, and I'm totally timid. So I watch literally like a few minutes a week. I'm totally terrified. And so I'm thinking about how, whatever we want to call it, horror, not horror, I'm thinking about how that Amazon series is trying to rework received tropes about our deepest anxieties and fears and so on, and to rework an inherited form from Lovecraft and kind of transmute it into the most amazing and beautiful production of Black performance and just Black being on the screen that I've seen, and also the most terrifying. And so I guess I'm thinking about how then, if I wanted, I could draw a line. I mean, I guess what do I want to say about that? Just that maybe every generation, every moment has its horror or its anxiety, and that we're at the moment now where thinking through anxiety can also include something like Lovecraft, which takes such pains to make sure that whatever terrors are on the screen, there's an attentiveness to what the black body will at least look like on screen.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what I want to say. It's not really answering your question, but that's what I want to say.
Yeah.
Boris, what are you thinking?
Well, I'm thinking that what everyone has said is very meaningful and resonant. I'm thinking, and I want to just add one thing, that Lewton worked on Gone with the Wind and actually scripted that scene with the camera panning out to show the soldiers. Yeah, but did not. I don't think he was particularly proud of the picture, and I think they fell out, he and Selznick, over the film. But what this film does, and what most of Lewton's films do, I think, is that they make us consider a fundamental question, which is, to what extent can we escape original sin? How can we deal with the sins of the past? How can we reconcile with the harms that we ourselves have done?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a question that is as true internally as it is socially and societally. A question with which we're grappling now, and I think we've all teased out of this film in our current moment the elements of that theme that are most relevant for us today. But I think that it's a many-sided diamond, and we can find other reflections of this in the film as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a fascinating point you make. I mean, just about the legacies of dealing with these atrocities, or of sin, the sins of the past, and how we come to grip with them has been, it seems like it's also been almost a through line through many of the films that we've seen over the course of the series so far. I want to thank all of you for being with us tonight and sharing your thoughts on this film. And to our audience, I wanted to ask if you have any suggestions for upcoming films that you think would be interesting, that relate to our current moment, that take us out of our current situation, but link us to larger ideas of community, and we can share those and discuss those. Please email us at Layka, Layka, at yiddishkite.org. And again, if you enjoy any of our programs, please consider visiting the Yiddishkite website to show you a little bit of support. Thank you, Boris. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Faith. And thanks to our behind-the-scenes team, Lisa Kenner-Grissom and Claire Fester, and also everyone at the Los Angeles Review of Books for helping make this possible. And from all of us at Yiddishkite, thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.